It's been a long time, hasn't it? Been a real fucking while. Why? Because I'm a lazy piece of shit who wanted to play Final Fantasy XIV. That's why. I know it's a shitty reason, but fuck you. I want to play as my perfect magical buff cat dad. Fuck you. Then it got worse because Evil Genius 2 came out, and in the days following its release, I literally did nothing but obsessively play that shit, to the point at which it screwed up my already delicate sleeping pattern. I've been too busy playing video games to write about playing video games, is the point. Anyway, we're here now, and this time we're talking about the suffering. The Suffering is, or was, a third-person horror shooter developed by Surreal Software and published by the long-dead Midway Games in 2004 for the PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. In the game, you play as silent, grizzled protagonist and Neanderthal Wolverine cosplayer Torque, a man whose name is not a real name. It's not related to anything, but Surreal Software's last game ever would end up being this game's sequel, The Suffering Ties That Bind, and despite The Suffering nowadays being relatively obscure, these two games are the only games they made that, as far as I can tell, anyone ever heard of. As I said, it's irrelevant, but I wanted to throw this out somewhere. At the start of the game, you find yourself being led into the death row section of the infamous Abbott State Penitentiary, located on the fictional and comically absurdly named Carnate Island, off the coast of the not-fictional and only slightly less absurdly named state of Maryland. We are informed by a pair of very friendly correctional officers that our shovel-jawed protagonist has been arrested for the brutal murder of his entire family. One son having been drowned in the bathtub, another having been thrown out of a window, and his darling wife having been beaten to death. Fun! Shortly after his incarceration, and I mean real fucking shortly, like minutes after the cell doors close, all hell literally breaks loose as an earthquake causes the power to go out while, more importantly, hideous body horror monsters appear and begin massacring everyone. Swiftly, another mysterious body horror monster releases Torque from his cell, and the game begins, as Torque runs and guns his way through Abbott and then Carnate Island entirely, in an effort to escape while also killing an entire town's worth of abominations, and accidentally laying some spirits to rest in the bargain. On a basic level, The Suffering is more or less what one would expect from an action horror shooter. Your character rushes around, shooting, leaping, jumping, shivving, axing, and occasionally grenading hordes of horribles that rush at you from the dark, from the ceilings, from the floor, from the water, and occasionally from quite literally nowhere. It was a bit of a mechanical oddity at the time, despite it now more or less falling in line with what one would expect from its genre, as horror games at the time were generally understood through the lens of the Silent Hill series and early Resident Evil games, with their tank-controlled, slow methodical gameplay, focus on careful resource management, and low enemy counts. This was a far cry from the frantic hordes of jittery freaks rushing into Torque's hail of plentiful gunfire and decent maneuverability. But it doesn't stop there. Even for shooters at the time, The Suffering was considered a bit strange, as it was designed first and foremost as a console game, with the PC release being a bit of an awkward port, as evidenced by some of the peculiar keybinds, such as using left alt as a use key. As such, one would have expected it to go along with what was apparently, expected at the time for console shooters, that being the gunplay being largely based around a lock-on system rather than manual aiming. Instead, as mentioned prior, The Suffering plays more after the fashion of PC shooters at the time, and, well, all console shooters post-Halo 1, what with you being required to manually aim at enemies instead of letting the game handle that for you. To do your shooting with, the game provides you with, honestly, a fairly typical but quite satisfying feeling set of weapons, from the surprisingly effective Shiv to the pleasantly punchy revolvers, the oddly anachronistic
Tommy gun!
surprisingly low damage shotgun, only good for one enemy fire axe, and then a selection of grenades, Molotov cocktails, and also only good for one enemy flashbang grenades. A fairly standard set of weapons, but then not every game needs to be a medieval or Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. Beyond the mundane weapons, the game also furnishes you with the capacity to Hulk out, seeing your friendly neighbourhood convicted felon turn into an 8-foot-tall roaring meat abomination with a sword for a hand. This functions like the rage mechanics that were quite common in the mid to late 2000s, building up an insanity meter until you are able to discharge it by becoming a whirling tornado of destruction. Or, at least, that's the idea. Unfortunately, Torque's meat monster form is only situationally useful, rather than being a drastic power-up, as while the form does deal a great deal of damage, it also presents you as being a much larger target for the ranged enemies. It lacks any kind of ranged attack itself, really, and if you leave it on for too long, it will kill you. While not entirely useless beyond the very early stages of the game in which all your enemies are melee focused and can be stun-locked by the Shiv if they come at you in low enough numbers, the rage form only becomes useful when you run out of ammo or find yourself in cramped enough quarters to be able to keep knocking down the ranged enemies with enough regularity that they can't get too many shots off at you until they die. Though it is also useful for seeing your morality level, because for whatever reason, when in rage mode, it appears in a tiny little bar off in the corner. I'm not sure why. Yes, the game does have a morality system, but I'll get to that later. The game follows a pattern of moving through the various environments, each of which are differing levels of abandoned and decrepit, fighting abominations, murdering or helping other survivors, occasionally solving simple environmental puzzles to move on, rinse and repeat for about 6 to 8 hours, depending on how much you die. There are a few boss fights, 4 in total, in the latter half of the game, though each of them fall more in line with puzzles than more traditional shoot-it-till-it's-dead bosses you'd expect from this kind of action title. The most complicated of which is against Hermes' Hate, we'll get to him, which involves you closing a bunch of vents and then forcing them into a furnace, and the most traditionally boss-like of these bosses is the final boss, which has you throwing blue shit at a giant's glowing fuck-me light for a while. The combat is fairly satisfying, if a little repetitive, each combat encounter more or less falling into the pattern of you walking into an arena only for you to get jumped by an entire football team or two's worth of monsters, your only indication of when to stop firing being when the composer stops slamming a crowbar against some pipes and oil drums, and the enemies stop spawning, often literally dropping down out from the sky or rising up from the ground. All of the enemies are tankier than you'd necessarily expect them to be, but thankfully the game is quite generous with its ammo placement, so you'll rarely find yourself in a really dangerous spot in that regard. Certain enemies have specific weaknesses to certain weapons, but I'll get into those specifics when I talk about the monsters themselves, as they are one of my favourite parts of the game. Suffice it to say, however, that with one exception, every enemy will die, regardless of what you hit it with, if you hit it with enough of it. Oh, and health. Should mention how the health works. The game has a mixture of regenerating health and the classic style of medkit pickups that you can store up to use as combat continues, in this case a bottle of pills called Zombium. However, if your health dips below roughly a third of the full bar, it will regenerate up to that third, but no further. Something which I barely noticed in the early stages of the game, but which saved my life as the game drew to its conclusion. Mechanically, the game is unsurprising, but satisfying. A solid third-person shooter, which was considered surprising in its time, but which, in hindsight, has a lot of the features and mechanical choices that would become quite typical of the genre, but typical does not necessarily mean bad. Anyway, it's plot time now. So, the story. At the start of the game, you find yourself being led into the death row section of the infamous Abbott State Penitentiary. I just fucking copy-pasted this from the overview, didn't I? We are informed that prior to Talk's arrival on the island, he was tried for and found guilty of the brutal murder of his family, though he claimed throughout the proceedings that he had blacked out throughout the entire ordeal, to which he was the only witness. Well, the only one who survived, anyway. It's later revealed that Talk has been plagued by such blackouts for his entire life, as well as bouts of psychotic rage. The rage is a kind of odd character choice for Talk, given that he is a silent protagonist who never seems particularly fazed by anything that happens around him, but that's neither here nor there. The truth of the matter is something about which there is no established canon, due to the aforementioned morality system, which I will aforementionedly get into in a bit. In essence, the plot of The Suffering is a remarkably simple one, in which the player has two goals, and two goals only. First and foremost, get the fuck off of Carnate Island, ideally alive. Second, deal with the ghosts that keep harassing you. Shortly after Talk escapes his captivity, and after he's mown down a church choir or two's worth of monsters, and hallucinated his dead family a handful of times, he runs headfirst into the closest thing the game has to an actual narrative direction, except for the aforementioned get the fuck out of Dodge. A trio of ghosts, all of whom want Talk to behave in different ways. The first of these is Dr. Killjoy, an old-timey mad scientist and Vincent Price lookalike who once ran the long-abandoned asylum elsewhere on the island. This fine fellow wants to use his somewhat, extreme methods to diagnose and treat whatever madness it is that plagues Talk. He also appears to have some small influence over the monsters, who from this point on I'll be referring to as malefactors, the name that's given to them in the sequel, in order to not just say monsters all the time. It is kind of unclear as to how or even why Dr. Killjoy seems able to manipulate the malefactors. It could even just be that he's taking advantage of their natural behaviour to assist himself, being incorporeal and all that. It's kind of hard for them to kill him. It's hard to say. Past a certain point, he even devises a means to resurrect Slayers, the standard melee enemies that are the most common foe in the game. I seriously don't understand why he does this. It's kind of an odd plot hole. It's implied that Dr. Killjoy is, in essence, a well-meaning if deranged psychologist whose methods were warped and ethics badly eroded by the dark power of Carnate Island. The next of the spirits is Horace P. Gage. He is a former inmate sent to Abbott State Penitentiary on a charge of assault. While in prison, he would murder his wife in a fit of passion during a conjugal visit, resulting in his execution. His spirit was then trapped in the electric chair that claimed his life. He attempted to convince Talk to save himself from the fate that he suffered, believing his fit of violence towards his wife he loved was born out of the inherently evil and corrupting influence of Carnate Island itself. He appears several times throughout the game, offering assistance and words of encouragement to Talk, though despite this he is ultimately a foe Talk must overcome, though not purposefully. And the final of the three spirits of Carnate is that of the previously mentioned Hermes T. Hate, the former executioner of Abbott State Penitentiary. He is a psychopathic killer who, in his time as the executioner at Abbott, took a perverse pleasure in his work, growing increasingly obsessed with death in all of its forms. He was already a grim man when he came to Carnate, only driven deeper into already present madness by the corruption of Carnate Island. He would eventually become so obsessed with death that he would commit suicide in the gas chamber he was so fond of, only to return as a ghastly green spectre made of that same toxic gas, spending his afterlife murdering correctional officers and inmates alike. He is the most uncaring of the three spirits, but his passive goal is to push Talk to greater acts of violence and murder, believing that he and Talk are quite alike. Each of these three figures appear at once, and spend the rest of the game attempting to sway Talk to follow the path that they desire for him. These three, along with the visions/hallucinations/apparitions of Talk's dead family, regularly appear to him as he fights his way through the prison and then across the rest of Carnate, offering advice, guidance, help, or just trying to spook him. Regardless of the spirits, or whatever moral choices you make, Talk makes his way through the prison, then the underground World War II era fort, before emerging into the world outside, and eventually reaching a radio building from which the Coast Guard can be contacted in order to seek rescue. Irritatingly, Dr. Killjoy is interfering with the signal, forcing Talk to fight his way to Killjoy's asylum to sort things out. There, he is forced into a peculiar form of treatment by Dr. Killjoy, which ultimately results in Torque destroying the projectors from which Killjoy manifests in order to shut down his interference and escape From there, Torque then fights his way back into the prison, partway through which he meets Horace trapped in his electric chair and is forced to fight not so much Horace as the chair itself, ultimately freeing the tortured soul and letting himself pass. There's a lot of just going through a place till a thing happens in The Suffering. It's not very plot-heavy. After travelling further through the prison and coming out the other side, Torque is forced by Hermes into a confrontation in the basement of a lighthouse. After cutting off the mad executioner's source of poisonous gas and blowing him into a furnace, Torque continues on. He returns power to the lighthouse generator and fixes the rotation mechanisms which had somehow become gummed up by malfactor parts, and then makes his way to the docks where, with the assistance of the somehow still extant Dr. Killjoy, he is forced to face himself in a final confrontation, first shooting down his own bestial rage form, and then having to use that same beast form to cut down a warped mirror version of his human self, before finally having to use Killjoy's strange machine to face down a titanic creature known as Torque's hatred. After successfully facing down his quite literal demons, Torque is finally able to escape Carnate Island, or just turn into a monster again and piss off back into the island. One of the two. He does one of the two. I fucked up the line, but I'm not doing it again. Throughout the game, Torque is plagued by visions of his deceased family, the tone and content of which will change depending on if you've been a very good boy or a very naughty boy. That's right, the game has a morality system, albeit a pretty simplistic one. Every now and again, the game will present you with choices. Very simple choices. Choices so simple that the game can be said to fall rather neatly into the criticism of morality systems, of them allowing you to pick between either upstanding moral virtue or being a baby-strangling maniac. Though in this case, it's quite literal baby-strangling maniac, because if you're evil, he drowned his son.
I don't know if I like being associated with this.
These choices almost always come in the form of meeting NPCs throughout the prison, many of whom are openly hostile, either verbally or physically. You'll know you've met one of these choice NPCs when you begin hearing two voices whittering on in Torque's head. One is that of his dead wife Carmen, who will urge him to at least help or save the NPCs, or maybe leave them alone, depending on the situation. The other is a chorus of demon voices, not too far from the voice of the Darkness from, well, the Darkness video game.
Calm down,
Fuck you.
Don't let your
When I see these
best
bastards spawn, I prefer to stay in the...
Which, tragically, never got a PC release, because it's a fucking amazing game that I adored, and it's a fucking travesty that only the kind of shitty sequel is available on the PC, because this world is cruel. The chorus of voices will basically always tell you to kill or fuck with anyone you encounter. Mechanically, the morality system, to my recollection, doesn't really have any effect on the gameplay, though it is visualized in the aesthetic of Torque himself. Good boy Torque is literally physically cleaner and less deranged looking, though he retains his distinctive Neanderthal jaw, while evil Torque looks like he's been rolling around in blood and shit for the last few hours, which, to be fair, is honestly the look that makes the most sense, considering what he gets up to throughout the game. The morality system's primary effect on the game is in terms of narrative, as your behaviour on Carnate Island literally changes the nature of the crime that saw Torque imprisoned in the first place, and changes his history with his family. On a neutral playthrough, Torque is just a kinda shitty guy with severe anger issues and untreated psychological problems, which caused him to accidentally kill his wife by beating her in a rage, causing her to collapse and crack her head against some furniture. This then led to one of his sons seeing the altercation, who then ran to the bathroom to drown his own brother before leaping from the apartment window and committing suicide. This is somehow the fucking wildest of the three possibilities to me. A dude with anger issues accidentally killing his wife, that I understand. That makes sense. I get that. I understand that. That's literally the backstory of Horace Gage, drawing an even closer comparison between him and Torque. But the son killing his brother before killing himself, it's kind of nuts. I'll accept him killing himself. It's the fact that his son drowns his brother that's the wild part of that particular backstory. The good ending has the death of Torque's family presented as a frame job by an enigmatic criminal figure known only as the Colonel, who sent armed masked goons into Torque's home to kill his family and then leave him alive as punishment for some slight. The sequel would reveal this Colonel to in fact be an evil figure known as Blackmore, but that's something to talk about when we get to the sequel, if we get to the sequel. And in the evil ending, Yeah, no, in the evil ending, he just randomly murdered his family. It's hardly surprising, given that in order to get that ending, you have to commit pointless acts of unprovoked violence on the other survivors of the literal apocalypse occurring on Carnate. It checks out. If he's going to randomly murder people who are already being killed by monsters, yeah, I can kind of see him just going nuts and killing his family. During each of these playthroughs, the visions and hallucinations of Torque's family the player is exposed to through the game's runtime also change, with the family being mocking and cruel towards Torque on an evil run, their spirits despising him from beyond the grave, to forgiving and comforting in a good run, more sad at how things transpired than angry at him. It's a very dramatic and rather simple system, but one that fits the rather over-the-top grindhouse horror tone of the entire experience. It's also worth noting that it can be argued that the three spirits of Carnate, Killjoy, Horus, and Hermes, represent each of the three possible morality paths. Horus and Hermes are obvious in this, being good and evil respectively, while Killjoy is a bit harder to justify, but one could argue that his utter disregard for Torque's actual behaviour in favour of focusing on attempting to cure him places him as the game's symbolic representation of neutrality. Also, for some reason, the Suffering Wiki argues that the spirits represent the past, the present, and the future, but I don't really understand why it says that, or how whoever wrote the wiki came to that conclusion. I don't get it. The morality system is simple, kinda dumb, but fine enough. And it gives you an excuse to at least play through the game twice to see the drastically different responses Torque's family have to him from the good and evil runs, and given the game is only some 6 hours long, it's not too big of an ask. Okay, here we go. Here it is. This is the reason that I fell in love with the Suffering all those years ago when I was but a chidlin of some 10 years old? Christ, I played this game when I was 10? I know my mum let me play whatever the fuck I felt like when I was younger, but somehow that surprises me in hindsight. Ah, well, when I was 10. This game has some pretty great enemy designs, visually, anyway. Rather than being generic demons or zombies, this game's enemies, the, as previously mentioned, malefactors, have both some actual creativity to them and some, admittedly, rather blunt symbolism going on with them. They are each representations of different forms of violent death and execution which have occurred on Carnate Island, and I'm going to talk about each of them right now. The Slayers, the spidery, melee, Voldo-looking motherfuckers, are representations of decapitation and are, for some reason, by far the most common enemy type you'll encounter throughout the game. They are relatively easy to kill, being stun-locked by the shiv and falling quite readily into a hail of gunfire, though later on in the game they will start getting back up unless you jib the bastards. Their swift, twitchy movement, ominous clattering as their sword limbs carry them across the island, and creepy hissing and shrieking sounds add up to what is essentially the poster-child enemy of the game. Next are the mainliners, arguably the other poster-child monster of the game. These creatures are representations of the Lethal Injection, appearing as malformed, squealing abominations whose every movement seems to cause them immense pain. They are absolutely covered in needles, which they will yank out from their own backs to chuck at enemies from afar, or use to attempt to stab their foes from up close by lunging at them. Their broken mutant legs are surprisingly strong. They're also absolute little bastards, as they can teleport around and are known to spawn in absurd numbers around water. These guys, more than any normal enemy, are the most likely to kill me, or you, mostly me, as their grapple attack does a surprising amount of damage, but then again, you are able to fight them off by, like, mashing buttons, so. From the small and whiny to the big and brawny, we come next to the marksmen, representations of those who were executed via firing squad, and, more specifically, tied to the World War II fort found beneath Abbott Penitentiary, and the mad officer who ordered whole swaths of his men shot for no good reason. They are big, tanky bastards who will tear you to pieces if you let them, though they are very vulnerable to a few well-placed Tommy gun bursts to the face. These are priority targets in any larger fights because they present the largest threat of any of the normal malefactors. Moving on, we have the Barnacles from Half-Life, reskinned to look like a flayed torso with a bag on its head. They drop down from the ceiling, hanging from nooses, and strangle you a bit before fucking off back into the ceiling. Honestly, they rarely appear, and when they do, they are easily avoided. If it wasn't obvious, they represent death by hanging, and they are called the Noose Men, which drives me up the wall that they're called the Noose Men and not Hangmen. I don't know why they wouldn't be called Hangmen. Then we have the Burrowers, representations of those buried alive. though, like the Marksman, they are more specifically tied to an event in Carnade's history, namely a cave-in which left several inmates trapped beneath the ground while the prison staff made no attempt to save them, essentially leaving them to their fate. The burrowers are extremely mobile, rushing around under the ground at high speeds before erupting from the earth in order to flail wildly at Torque with the chains that keep them bound up. They are pretty awkward to fight unless you know the trick to them. After they emerge from the earth and then return to it, for a few moments, they leave a hole leading to the tunnels they make as they move. If you chuck an explosive, any kind of explosive, into the hole, it is a one-shot kill for that burrower. This is basically the only use of the flashbang grenades. Next, and almost last, we have the Festers. These figures are a bit of a break from the pattern of the other malefactors, being representations of both the victims and perpetrators of a particularly grim death. They emerge from a slave ship that ran aground on the shores of Carnate Island, the slave cargo within left to drown and die while the slavers themselves fled, the unfortunate slaves both drowning and being consumed by panicked rats as the ship took on water. The Festers appear as gigantic grey corpses, bloated by decay and absorbing seawater, and filled with those same ravenous rats. They are one of the more difficult enemies to face, as most weapons simply won't work on them. Only the fire axe melee weapon and explosives do any damage to them, but they are best tackled through the use of Molotov cocktails, as upon their death they will release a pack of rats, which will then rush towards the nearest hostile target, normally you, and hurl themselves at said target, exploding on impact. If killed by a Molotov, however, the rats burst into flames upon spawning from the corpse, instantly dying harmlessly. The final malefactor is by far the most intelligent of them, the Inferna. These flaming witch girls are representations of, oddly, three specific figures from Carnate's history. A trio of young girls from a Puritan village that once existed upon the island who falsely accused several women of being witches, leading to their incendiary deaths. Now it seems, almost as punishment, the three girls are doomed to constantly burn in the same fires they forced upon the innocent women. Unlike the other malefactors, who appear to be almost animalistic in their behaviour, simply attacking and making meaningless sounds, the Inferna actually speak, and mock, and deliberately trap their victims. It is implied, at least to my mind, that the Inferna you fight throughout the game are always the same three creatures, simply reappearing from the flames over and over again. Shortly before the game ends, you actually see the three Inferna girls in their pre-incendiary forms throw themselves from a cliff, seemingly to their watery graves. After this, the Inferna cease spawning entirely, implying that the source of the creatures, or simply the only three of the creatures that ever existed, are now gone. Oddly, despite the creatures being borderline animalistic in their behaviour, they do seem to break down roughly into factions, and are quite prone to infighting. Any of the enemies will attack another malefactor if they are accidentally hit by one of their compatriots, though the Slayers are the most prone to this as they often get in the way of each other's attacks while pursuing Torque. Though the mainliners, Slayers, and Festers will attack each other on sight, often ignoring Torque entirely, until only one of the sets of beasts remains, or unless Torque attacks them. Exactly why they fight with each other is unknown, but it does add to the chaotic feeling the malefactors bring. Plus, it's always nice to see monster infighting. Big fan. It's worth noting that the game actually features an in-game encyclopedia of sorts written by an in-game NPC called Clem, which discusses each of the enemies and even touches upon the spirits of Carnate, Killjoy, Hermes, and Horus, and even mentions both Torque's family and the final boss, Torque's hatred. I'm a big fan of the inclusion of this particular feature, and believe it may have been what caused my lifelong love of bestiaries and the such like. Now, this is an interesting question. Is The Suffering, an action horror game, actually scary? Personally, I'd say, I don't know. For me, no. Well, when I started playing the game again for this review, the game did make me jump once or twice initially. The game doesn't really do a great job of being all that frightening or tense. I think a lot of this is due to the simple fact that the game is so action-heavy. It's hard to remain afraid of and nervous about creatures that you regularly mow down in their tens with little difficulty. While the game has many of the trappings of horror, including an obnoxious habit of randomly trying to jump scare the player by suddenly flashing a few frames of a horror image over the screen accompanied by an aggressive music sting, it is a very campy, almost haunted house kind of horror, relying on loud noises and sudden gory imagery to startle rather than scare. And while it does occasionally startle, it'd be more accurate to say the game is an action game with a horror aesthetic, rather than a real horror game. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Honestly, that's a lot of why I like it. It nails a horror aesthetic of dirty, grimy locations, body horror flesh nightmare monsters, and ominous spectral happenings, and uses them to enhance a fun, energetic, run-and-gun style shooter. It seems to fall in line with the tone I believe a lot of horror media designed for long-term horror fans, the kind of fans that are hard, if not impossible to really scare anymore, adopts. That of a somewhat campy yet still sincere effort at being entertaining and nailing the aesthetic, while not worrying too much about being legitimately frightening, being more concerned with just being entertaining with that aesthetic. I mean, Dr. Killjoy is literally a Vincent Price reference. The game makes its intentions quite clear from that alone, I think. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed reading this essay as much as I enjoyed writing it. Also, I genuinely almost forgot to do this joke. This time had to very quickly write it into the script, and record this as I was doing the editing. Well, in summary, The Suffering's pretty good, I think. It still holds up as a fun experience with some engaging visuals and a simple but satisfying story. It's available on GOG as well as floating around somewhere online as freeware because for some reason, the US Air Force did that. I really don't know how The Suffering's PC release ended up being freeware put out by the fucking Air Force, but apparently that happened. I will warn, however, that the PC version of the game is a wee bit unstable, and even with the fiddling I did with it in order to get it running in a modern resolution, and on the correct monitor, it was still quite prone to odd graphical glitches and crashes around once an hour. Sorry it took so long to get another review out, just nothing really grabbed me for a while. Hopefully it won't be as long until the next one comes out. I'm considering doing the sequel to The Suffering Ties That Bind, but I have nowhere near as much of an attachment to that game. I only played it the once when I was like 19, and honestly I don't know how different it is to the first game, so it remains to be seen if I'll actually cover that one. Anyway, we're done here now. Bye.